Hello everyone, thank you for coming, joining the session today. The subject of the session today is the structure of the agent database for distributed migrations. Just to remind everyone, distributed migration is a migration model that comes to improve the time it takes to complete large migration jobs by distributing the workload on multiple machines. The paradigm is migration that configure that there's one controller and several agents, and the controller is the managing and configuring the agent jobs. Today on the agenda, we'll focus on what is the agent database, what it is used for, what are the different tables that are in the agent database, and what is in each table used for. And also we'll have a presentation of the actual SQL, and we'll go through the structure of the tables and see how it works. In the diagram that you see before you, it shows us how the distributed model works and what are the different components. We see one component is the controller, is basically a content metrics console, the regular content metrics console. And we have the agent database and the agents. When you configure the distributed model, the controller pushes and creates the agents and the agent database. What we see here is more the relationship among the different components of the model. We see that the big arrow pointing from the controller to the agent is basically saying that it is the controller. Secondly, what would go directly from the controller to the agents are basically the PowerShell scripts that they will be executed at the agents. A lot of information and communication goes through the agent database. At the beginning, the controller would push information to configuration information to the agent database, and this configuration information will be read by the agent and provide the agent with the information that needs to be run when the PowerShell scripts are being pushed through the PS exec. We also see that the arrows push a point to the agent database from the agent. This would be more of logs, migration logs that update the agent database. Let's go forward with the next screen and go a little bit further in information what is available. So the agent database is one of the two SQL database that are being created in the distributed migration at the setup. The other one is the metabase. We are not going to talk about this, and it's not really needs an extension in the to go further in the information about that. What does the agent database contains? It stores a configuration for agent machines as pushed from the controller. What information it needs to be pushed? And the first one is the environment settings that we use usually from the file system when it's local, from the standalone machine. So it would at the setup, it would push the environment settings. Usually in the environment settings, it is located in C program data methodologics. We would have, it's an XML, and we would have um, some configurations. Let's say one of them would be timeout for web communication or timeout for SQL connections, etc. The next one is the application settings. The application settings usually is located at the app data. Let's start from the beginning for C, users, user, app data, roaming methodologics, content metrics console. And it contains, again, configuration information, for example, a maximum request chunk size when we are talking about chunks in migration, or some basic information about email notification, etc. Also, the user settings is being pushed to the agent, and the user mapping. User mapping is for mapping accounts from one environment for another, let's say from local environment to the Office 365, or maybe from domain accounts to a claims account. So this is being pushed to the agent. It also stores the history of the operations on the agents. Those are more management of the agent, provisioning of the agent, what is going on in the agent life cycle for the of the provisioning of the model, of refreshing sometimes, and then also information on running jobs. As I mentioned earlier, there are also logs. Usually when it is a standalone machine, one content matrix console, we have the job history .lst file where the logs are saved. This time, in this distributed model, all the logs of the migration will be saved in the database on one table. There are some other tables exist, like that serve the internal operation tables and are not really not very interesting for us. As I mentioned earlier, but for clarifications, the PowerShell scripts that actually run the jobs at the agent are not being communicated to the agent through the database, but directly through PowerShell exec. Interesting to know, though, that you might be aware that whenever we change, let's say, parameters in the environment settings, we maybe in some situation when you had a call with support, we tell you you have to restart the content metrics console in order to have those changes in configuration in effect. In this paradigm, you would not do that because you don't run content metrics as with the user interface. Those updates would be applied on the next run of the next script, PowerShell script. Also, the database would contain the ID of the PowerShell job that was pushed to the agent. This is basically a list of the different tables in the database. It gives you just by the names some understanding what the purpose of each one of them. One is for the history of the agent events, the list of the agents, certificate details, job creation details, job history, individual jobs with their corresponding IDs, and the job log items together. They work as the logs for all the agents and the controller. And what would be the most interesting for us is basically the user data. This is where the application and environmental settings files would be pushed as the configuration files for the agents. Also the user mapping, as I mentioned earlier. With this clarified, I think we are ready to see some action on the SQL and see and look further at the table structure, and we'll have some information. Thank you.
Hello, this is Wes Sampson here. We do have some references for this. If you just did a quick search on this, when it's available, you will see it in their KBs on how to set up the distributed migration. And a lot of the information we've gone into, some of it is in here, not on the specific databases, tables, but there are some information in here for your references. Right here you see I have a content matrix console open. I ran a few jobs. Just to start this off, we're actually going to go through each individual table in the SQL database, as you can see here, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I have set up a few things. I pasted a site collection. I created a new site collection. The statuses are here like you'd normally see it, and you can see that it was executed on the controller. So I actually ran this from this machine, which would be the controller. I created, via the configured distributed migrations, two agents, one called DM1 and one called DM2. You can actually see these in here and the availability that they're in, and we'll talk about this a bit further. I created two jobs, and these were actually pushed remotely. As you can see, they created it on the controller, but push to the agent and run successfully. This is an agent database, so a database name that I created, that when you're setting it up, you can actually create the database name. I just called it Sandbox Agent DB, and you can see there's multiple databases in tables in here that we can discuss. The first one I want to discuss today is just agents. So let's open this up. And I'd like to know the reason that I'm going through this today is a lot of these database tables you're not going to manually touch. One of them you are going to manually touch in the distributed migration monitor is the user data, and I'll come down to an advice why. But I get a lot of questions of what are these other ones, and most of them you don't need to touch because you can actually do everything in the console, but I'd like to explain them anyway. The reason I'm doing this one first is because this is the one that actually shows the agents, and you can see that here's my two agents that I created. It gives some really good information. It gives it a specific GUID, or actually, yeah, GUID agent ID, DM1, DM2, the OS version, the version of content matrix I'm using, my username, an encrypted password, the status that it's in, and the role of it, an agent. One thing to look at, though, is job executable allowed. That's basically the PowerShell restrictions. Are you able to run a PowerShell script from that job? You can see a lot of this information just by going in here. You can see most of it is in here. You don't see the OS version, etc., or even if the script is there, but it is important information. So now that I've showed you DB agents, I'm going to go to the DB job history. We'll open this one up here. Now you can see that it doesn't actually say the agent ID doesn't actually say the agent name. So that's why I showed that first table. It's actually using the GUID. And what you'll see here is timestamps. Even if you scroll up and scroll down, they may not all be separated together, so it'd be a bit hard to read using this version. But it does store this details. That being said, you can go into the Content Matrix console at any time, and if you go to Manage Agents and view the agent, it will pull from that database the agent name via that ID and everything that's happened. And as you can see, it goes, the first entry is the job, but the first one is exactly what I did. So I did the installation, the configuration, everything is here, the history of the agent. Now, if I were to remove this agent, it will delete this information. And if I recreated it, it would create it from scratch, just to let you know. Same thing with this one here. If you view the agent, basically the same information because they are quite new and I only ran one job. One good thing to know though is for controller and agent mismatches, if you have a different version of the console, it'll actually tell you this. And the same thing for the status if it's running or if there's an issue with it, it'll give you a status on what that is. Okay, so the next one is agent settings. There's really not much in there at all, so I'm not even going to go over it. It's pretty blank. I'll show it to you. It's just a GUID ID. There's really nothing in there that's really permanent. The same thing for the user profiles. There's really nothing in there. Just the remote user is given a GUID. One thing I do want to go over though is the certificate details. Most of our customers when using this product only have one certificate, but it is possible to have multiple certificates. So if you're familiar with distributed migration at all, when you're actually setting up the configuration, you can actually give it a certificate, deploy the certificate to it. And you can use multiple certificates if you need to. Not sure why you would want to, but if you needed to, they would all be shown in this actual certificate here. And just the name of it. Nothing pertinent to the certificate itself, just the name. The job creation details. Now, if we open this up, you will see that I have 3 jobs. It doesn't give a lot of information to it. But one thing I'll notice is that each one of these jobs, if you take a look at the Content Matrix console, I have 3 jobs. Each of these jobs corresponds to one of these lines. It's hard to tell exactly which one, and most of that information is not really necessary here. But if you were to, let me just pull this back a bit, and let's take a look at one of my agents. So I sent over a job to this agent, and what it does is it'll send a Powershell script to C:\Metalogic scripts by default. You'll see that the GUID that was given for this job is B8887 cab 2 with a bunch of characters. Now if you go back to the job, you can see that it corresponds to the same job ID. So in troubleshooting purposes, if you needed to use this, we could always see what job was run. That being said, let's go take a look at job history. Now, the job history, same IDs. So you can see that if you, of course, take a look, paste site collection, that's the ID. These are the 2 remote jobs that I did. You can see that what they were, pasting list, and what they have done. And the information is in here. Basically showing source, target, username, and what machine it's been run on, versions, usernames. But this information is actually also available in the Content Matrix. Let me just expand this again. Looks like you can see that most of the information is already there. So viewing of that table outside of this, not really necessary. But it's good to know. The second portion, and just to show you, is the actual individual actions that each job did. So if we take a look at this job ID, let's say for 3887, it was a paste list. If you were to actually open up that, you will see that every single thing that was done when migrating is recorded in here. If you scroll down, you will eventually get, as there's so much done in one migration, you will get to that. Now, we wouldn't ask you to look into this for each and every single item to see if it failed or completed, because you can actually see that directly into the console. You can either export the job to Excel, create a support zip file, or if you want to view it right here, you can just double click on it and all the entries will be in the logs here. So most of the data that's in the database is available into the Content Matrix console, and in this case it's the controller for all the agents. One thing I'd like to show you though as well is the job templates. Now this is the feature that you may use. You can see that it has some information here. One of them is that job templates, and a lot of you may not be aware what job templates are, but if you take, I'll show you real quick. It just saves them in here for usage in the Content Matrix console. So let's say that we were maybe creating a site collection. So I'm not going to recreate a job. I'm just going to change the configuration of one of them. You can actually open job configurations And as you can see, say I have a job configuration that I'd saved using the Save Job Configuration feature that's in here. So if you have multiple jobs that are running and you know it's all going to be the same configuration, you can always apply it, import new ones if need be, and it'll all be saved in the SQL database. But it's viewable from here. We'll just add it and it'll actually won't be applied. All the current configuration will be lost. And that, or even if I save the job, give it a second. Let's just call it Quick Takes. We'll save that job. We won't run it. We'll go back to the database and let's just open that up again. And you'll see now that I have a new one here saying Quick Takes. So it is stored into the database. Again, it's not something we'll look at every day. I'm going to skip over user data for a moment and just go to user mappings. If you take a look at what I have, you'll see that I only have 2 user mappings, some internal users we have here going to Office 365. Again, you don't need to manually change this, but it's good to know where it's at because, as you know, in Content Matrix, you can actually configure global mappings, and from there, it won't show you anything unless you actually pick a target or a source, and as soon as you pick that target or source, take it a few minutes, and then there's the mapping. So if I were to remove one, unmap, hit OK, go back to the database, and theoretically may not do it in real time. Yep, there you go. It has removed one. Now the reason I skipped user data is that in a standalone system, there are environmental settings. For example, just to show you one of them, if you go to program data, and if you're ever on any troubleshooting with us, we probably would get you to maybe change the environmental settings at some point. And there are certain, for example, SQL queries, web service timeouts, etc. Now, in the distributed model, it's all in the database, and we're going to have another quick takes to explain a lot of this in the future. But just to go over that, if you want to change these settings, it's not going to work if you change it here because it's not lively pushed up. So you actually have to change it in the database itself. So if we were to open up, edit the top 200 rows, and you could do this manually like this or even with a SQL script, but you can see that it has application settings, and also, and if you look at these, spread them out a bit, it looks like there's repeats, but they're not, because some are for file share edition and some are for content matrix. And this just happens to be, if I were to set up a different edition of our software, you would see those in here too, if they were applicable. You know, you could change land settings, things like that. But most importantly, it's just to know that you need to change them inside the actual database. As you can see, I had a timeout at 5:54. Well, when I created this, I never used this file. I allowed it to use the default. So the web service configuration, even though it's on the desktop, this is for web service timeouts. It's set to 545 seconds. Since I didn't use the defaults, I used the defaults when I set this up. If you take a look for that same one, which is web service timeout, I'm actually at 300, which is 5 minutes. So this would be the most important table that you would be concerned with in distributed migration, as this is where you would actually change something. And now how Gil had mentioned is if you do change something, it won't happen for the existing job that you're using. Usually with a standalone system, you actually have to restart the console. And if you were to run a job locally on this console, you would actually have to restart it as well. But if you were going to push a job remotely, it should be fine, because it will be fine, because as soon as the PowerShell exe is stopped from one job, that change has been made, and you push it remotely, it will use those settings. And that's about all I have for this portion of the configuration. So start with the Q&A with questions. There is one question here. Once I install Content Matrix on all my agents, do I ever have to run a Content Matrix console on any of the agents? Or is it possible to do all the management and troubleshooting from the host/controller? Actually, you never need to run it from the console. Basically, once you set it up, there is no need. Once you push it remotely, I'll even push this job remotely again. We'll send it to, let's see what it's going to go to DM1. You can see on DM1 there is actually nothing running. What you're going to see is you're going to see a PowerShell script. Eventually, there it is, PowerShell. And it's going to run via PowerShell. And if you take a look, let me refresh this. There's the PowerShell script that's going to run. If you edit it, open it up, that's the actual PowerShell script that's running. I won't go into this, but that is what it's running in the background for, let me close this, in the background process right here. We'll just refresh the job. Next question. If I need to reinstall one of the agents, what would be the correct way to uninstall the agent and install it again? Well, the correct way would be to go into your actual connections and manage your agents. Since you already have this set up, you could actually just right-click and remove the agent. I could do it here, but it does take a bit of time, so I'll do it. I'm not sure how much time it will take, but once it's removed, if it was an agent in the before, we could just hit Add Agents. You'd put in your agent name. It should automatically grab the IP address, the name you're connecting with, and then I would ask you to pick the actual certificate that you set up. And then you should remember the password of the certificate that you had. And then it will connect. And it would configure itself. What you could do is hit View Agent, and you can see that it's actually starting this off. And as you noticed earlier before, I had mentioned if you remove and re-add, it'll actually get rid of the whole history, and it does. As you can see the configuration it started, it's going to try to reinstall everything. You probably noticed it already has the binaries in there, and it's pretty well done. Right now, it's available and ready to go. Another question here that goes with that. Does content matrix settings change in the database take effect right away, or does the console need to be restarted in order to take effect? With the standalone version, if you made a change in an XML file, you would have to restart the console itself. If you made the change in the database and were to run a job locally on the actual controller, which is not what the controller is meant for. As you can see a job here, but you can run things locally. It won't take effect. You would have to restart it. But since you're running them remotely, it will look into the database and see if the changes are. So the changes are real time. So you make a change to a web service timeout. If you're pushing it remotely, it'll take effect right away. The next job, if there's jobs running or currently queued, the queued jobs will work, but not the running job. So if you had a long running job and you wanted to up a timeout, you'd have to wait for that job to complete or cancel it and restart it. Another question here. Can I use a SequenceEE database for an agent DB? So that would be SQL Compact Edition. Can you use that as the agent DB? Now with SQL Compact Edition, the files are actually located on the actual hard drive. So that's not supported because they're actually just files such as the jobhistory.lsd. If you look right here, this is the original one. That's a SequenceEE database, jobhistory.lsd. It's not supported, hasn't been tested. It's not good in this scenario because all the agents need to connect to this. And they wouldn't have the connection that a full SQL server would give you by just using it for SequenceEE. It may be possible, but it's definitely not been tested. Another question is, how do I use the information presented today in my troubleshooting? Well, a lot of it, not much you can use. Most of it, it's all inside the console. The log files are in the console. Everything's in the console. But for troubleshooting purposes, if you did see a timeout, you would need to go into the user data and take a look for that timeout. So you can see that we have one of the most common things we have is, for example, timeouts using the Metalogix web extensions or even the SQL server. And you can see that I'm going to expand this a bit. The SQL query timeout is set to 30 seconds. So maybe you'd want to set it to 90 seconds. And basically it's done. You can modify it like that, or you could use a SQL script to modify it itself. There are other settings that can be changed. As you know, I was talking about the web services timeout. All these settings can be changed, but these are the most popular ones. I could change this to 600, which would be 10 minutes because it's by seconds. And there's other things like, for example, pipe. Open and close. If you're going to SharePoint Online, you can actually increase these here and have them all set to 30. There's everything can be changed, but usually the default settings are okay. Now for troubleshooting, distributed migration, if you're talking to us, we might actually get you to go into the agent database and take a look at it, and then we'll take a look to see what OS you're using, or if it pulled the information. Is the job allowed? Is the agent in available status? If there's a problem, this will actually say error. You can also view a lot of that in the console itself under the manage agents. As you can see, it's unavailable because the jobs are run. But sometimes if there's a problem, it might be an error. It could be some other process stopping. Troubleshooting, most of it's done all on the controller or the agent itself. A lot of the database is more informational and what you want to do. But one important one I want to stress is that user data. And that being said, we are going to schedule another quick takes on the difference between the standalone and the distributed migration. So you may want to join that in the future.